What's up everybody, Sam Smyers here. Today I want to give you some tips on how to create 90s rave house stabs. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, please go ahead and subscribe. And also if you would like to support me, go ahead and head over to store.samsmyers.com where you can find a bunch of my serum presets to download. The reason that I want to do this video is because I feel like 90s rave house stabs have become popular again. And this video is going to be a shorter version of another video by a YouTuber that goes by the name of Tim Kantz. He has a video that is like the beginner's guide to rave house stabs. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more about the history of some popular rave house stabs and also learn how to remake some of those popular house stabs. That video is about 30 minutes long, so I just want to do something a bit shorter and specifically about how to make rave house stabs. I first want to show you this program called Rave Generator. Now, apparently this does not work with more recent versions of Macs. I think maybe with the M1 chip. Don't hit me up asking me how to make it work on your Mac because I don't know. I just have like a Mac OS 10.14, so whatever version that is, and then I'm also using Ableton 10. It seems to work on my computer. It's only just really a sampler, so it has a bunch of samples and you can scroll through them. So I almost want to just create a sample pack or something of just these samples. So maybe I'll figure out how to do that and provide like a download link. But at the moment, this is probably the best way to get a lot of those 90s rave house stabs is use this Rave Generator because it takes a bunch of these stabs from popular songs in the 90s and it labels them by the name of the song where they came from. So I believe this Landlord stab was from a song called Landlord, and then this is probably from a song called Party Children. This one was probably from a song called Alex Party, and it was from a CZ organ, which I think is like a Casio organ. So maybe you heard this sound before. This one sounds pretty popular. It's just the Alex Party sound. I've heard that in some tech house songs recently. What's also cool about this program is you can just stack all of the sounds on top of each other. So I could have this sound and then this sound together. Now, the thing about these samples is that they're not tuned to the keys that you're playing, so you have to adjust the tuning here and also the fine tuning to get them to fit with your keyboard or fit in tune with each other because they're just direct samples of the songs that they came from, so they're not like tuned to the keyboard. So then you have this Party Children one, which I think is also pretty popular. This Landlord stab is like just a piano stab. And there's like some of those Hoover stabs, like the Mortal Kombat stabs, like there's a bunch of other cool stabs in this program. So basically, let me just show you a song that's pretty popular now that I think it's like charting on Beatport. It's by James Hype, and this is Lose Control. He has these style of rave stabs in that song. So I feel like I was able to come up with something similar just using this Rave Generator. So that's the pattern. And it's just this Landlord stab and then a house stab on top of it. And I had to tune them a bit to get them to sound right. So this one's tuned 5 and this one is tuned -12 because I want it to be lower. So if I raise this up, so I don't know if he used Rave Generator. I just found that that got a pretty similar sound to the song. And then I just like EQ'd it a bit and added like an 1/8 note echo. And I like using a very short echo. I think that works really well for these type of 90s house stabs. You can hear it's very quiet. I didn't want it to overpower the stab. And I'm just using like an 1/8 note delay. You could use something like a slapback delay. And also for these 90s house stabs, I tend to like using mono sounds because that is part of the texture of the like 90s rave songs, is that they tend to have a lot of like mono sounds in them. So don't get too crazy with like widening your sound or adding stereo spread or like chorus or like I even was trying out using reverb, but I felt like it maybe widened it too much, and maybe like a slight chorus, slight reverb would work, but I felt like this echo, which is just like a mono echo, worked well for this sound. So that's kind of like basically that James Hype song. And so if you do want to create these stabs yourself, usually these stabs are made up of a chord. So that's part of what makes them unique is that they're made up of multiple notes and layers of notes, and it's also taking a sample from an old orchestral song, a funk song, a soul song, putting it into your song, and then resampling it again, resampling it again, resampling again. You get a bunch of like unique textures. And so that's kind of what was happening in the 90s, is that there were songs that would find a particular stab, and then another song would come out a few years later, resampling the sample of that original song. So they would just like resample the other like 90s house song. So it was just kind of like a bunch of resampling of a bunch of similar sounds, and that was giving like a unique texture to these 90s rave house stabs. So if you do just want to like try to come up with your own type of stabs, then I always start out with some type of minor chord. So let's say C minor. C minor is a pretty popular key to use for house. I'm going to do like a C minor 7. It's going to give me a bit of a jazzy feel. And of course, I just have the Korg M1 piano, this M1 house piano. This is your classic M1 house piano. And there's a bunch of other cool sounds in here I could test out. I could try using something like an organ. So let's say I want to use this like hit round one, and I can take off the delay and stuff. So there's just like an organ sound, and basically you don't have to use just like a keyboard sound for these type of stabs. You can use any type of sound, orchestral sounds, strings, layer a bunch of sounds on top of each other. So for this one, I'm just going to do the M1 house piano and the organ, and what I will do is bounce that down to audio. So I already did that. I bounced down that stab to audio. Here's the key one, and then here's the organ one. So there I have my stabs, C minor. Maybe you'd want to just like rename this piano C minor 7 or something, however you want to label your samples and stuff, and then hit Command and J. That will consolidate it into a sample. You could do something like that to just help you create samples. So then I loaded that into sampler. So this one is keys. This is the M1 house piano in my sampler in Ableton. I set the root note to C because it was a C minor. And then I just did the same thing, just did some EQ, added some compression, and added an 8th note echo. And then here's just like a chord or like a progression I came up with. So let's maybe throw on some drums on top of that. And then if you're going to actually make that into a full song, really you just add on like a bass layer playing the root notes, and that would basically be your house song, that house vibe. So pretty simple. Now the thing about these 90s house rave stabs that I think makes them unique is that they tend to be a bit dissonant. They tend to have notes that are not specifically in the key, because what happens is I just took a C minor chord and then I just played it on my keyboard. Now the thing is, if I am writing a song in C minor and I play a C minor, so this is going to be a C note, but of course it's playing the C minor, and if I play this, it's an F, but it's going to be an F minor. Those are both in the key of C minor, but if I play A flat or G sharp, if I play an A flat minor, that's not in the key of C minor. That would be an A flat major that would be in the key of C minor. So G minor is in the key, so it's really just this one chord that really isn't in the key of C minor. Now, the thing is, this is what adds to kind of like that feeling of house music, is that there's something a little bit imperfect about it that I like, and that's going to be just these house stabs playing notes that are not specifically like in the key, or this isn't like this exactly the right chord. Now, there's a video with Jacob Collier where he's on YouTube and he's talking about like harmonies, and he's going through talking to people who are beginner to advanced, and he's explaining to them in one of these sections how as long as you play the bass note in the key, you can essentially get away with any other notes on top of that bass note playing the melody.
Essentially what that demonstrates is that every note and every bass note are compatible. So once we realize this, it's like, that's great. Now what should we do? What?
It doesn't have to necessarily be in the key. So that's what I took away from that video, and that's what I get away from this like 90s house music, is that even though playing this A flat minor isn't really in the key, It's still going to work as long as you're playing the bass notes correctly. So as long as you're playing like an A flat bass note, and then you can get away with, then it can still be in that C minor key. Because let's say people say, well, why not just play the MIDI of the stab? So like if I were to play the MIDI, here's just an M1. This one is, this would be the correct chords here. See, there's that A major 7. So A major 7, let's see, I got, not A major, A flat major 7. So A flat, C, E, and then G. So let's go to this website, A flat major 7, A flat, C, E, G. But instead what ends up happening is because I'm just shifting down a C minor chord into an A flat minor chord, what ends up happening is I end up playing an A flat, B, E flat, and an F sharp, so G flat. So that's what I end up playing instead. So that's these notes. As opposed to these notes, which would be the actual notes in the key. So that's kind of like what makes these house stabs unique, is that especially if you're layering multiple chords on top of each other, multiple stabs on top of each other, you just kind of get like this really like dissonant sounding stab, which kind of sounds in the key, kind of doesn't sound in the key, but as long as you have kind of like your bass note playing something in the key, then it tends to work. So then I played you that key sound. This is just going to be the organ sound. And then the keys and the organ together. Like, let's say I wanted to layer these on top of each other. Maybe put on some drums. So now let's say, what if I wanted to sample my own stabs? Well, I could go to just Splice and type in Rave into the soundbar and then find these warehouse Rave stabs, a bunch of these sounds, and then just put them in a sampler. But what if you just go back to the types of sounds that they were sampling back then? So let's assume back then they were sampling like old vinyl soul records, funk records, orchestral records. Then it would make more sense for me to just find some like cool funk stabs or something like that. Now with Splice, you're usually going to find things where they're like remaking the sound to try and make it sound old, but you can usually find some pretty decent things. So I was able to find this one pack called Reworked Soul Selection, and you can search like resampled, reworked, and this will kind of help you find these type of sounds where they record them and then they reprocess them. This one says they actually cut the sounds to vinyl and then brought them back to digital. So that's going to give it some extra character and texture. And this is what you want to look for if you want to create some unique house stabs. So as I was going through these, I found this little loop which has those stabs in there, which you've got like the drums and the horns in the strings. So you have all those really nice layers, and that's going to produce a really nice sounding house stab if I can sample some of those stabs from this loop. So if I just put that loop into my sampler, I can play around with it now. I can just use this little thing to select where I want it to start. And so I like this little stab. Now, in order to figure out what chord that is, I use this program called Chroma. And for some reason, it doesn't work on MIDI. At least it doesn't work on MIDI for me. So what I did is, this is the vinyl loop that I imported. So I just looped this little part, which is the part that I wanted to sample. And if I open up this Chroma, then it's a chromogram. So it takes the frequencies and lays them out according to this grid, and it displays the frequencies that are the strongest aligned up with these notes. So every note has a specific frequency. If you look at like a spectrogram or like a frequency spectrum analyzer, each note is usually tied to a specific frequency. And so this is able to identify, well, these frequencies are the strongest, so it's likely going to be this note. So you can adjust the brightness and contrast and stuff. So let's just go and loop this, and let's see what we hear. So you can see there's a D, F, A, and it's pretty spot on as far as like the tuning. So I don't really need to adjust the sample, the tuning very much. I'm just going to leave it as is. So D, F, A, and then we've got that A sharp there. So that's going to be like a D minor with A sharp, whatever. Any music theory people want to tell me what that is that like added 6 or something? I don't know. So anyway, if I put this into my sampler, I know it's a D chord. So I'm just going to put my root at D so that my notes are correct. So let's go ahead and just loop this. So you can hear it's kind of like detuned on these two notes. Doesn't really sound that great, but if I layer it with some keys, so now that's the funk loop sample layered with that M1 key. So this is, I'm basically doing the resampling. We're gonna go ahead and resample these two sounds. I'm going to bounce them to audio. So I'm going to bounce the keys in the funk loop to audio, and then I get this. And then I'm going to go ahead and sample that again. So I'm going to resample it essentially because I'm doing what they were doing back in the 90s, just like resampling sounds. So now if I import that into my sampler, and I'm going to choose this first note, which is a C, so I can leave my root note at C. And you can hear every time that I'm kind of resampling, I'm getting like a whole new texture. So now I have my own like house stab, and let's go ahead and just hear what that sounds like with the drums. So there's my own unique house stab. It sounds really cool. It's got a lot of like these notes are pretty interesting, kind of like has that dissonance that I was talking about. But if I add in like a really cool bass melody and then have like a really strong singer or something, add in some of those like high house strings, then it could end up sounding really cool. So that's just like using sampler. You could also use Granulator. This is so I loaded in just the funk loop into Granulator, and you can just, I have a video on how to use this, but Granulator is pretty cool because you can like play around with the grain sizes. Like, so that's kind of like the size of all of these little sections that is cut up. So it takes the audio sample, cuts them up into these little like pieces, and you can change this grain size. So let me just play it on my keyboard. And you see it's kind of looping. And I'm just changing the grain size. I can change the file position. So this might be useful if you want to like audition parts of that the audio sample. So I do have a video on like how to actually use this Granulator. James Hype uses this Granulator, and he takes like a crowd noise sound, and then he plays the crowd noise, just like a really small section of this crowd noise in a small grain size. And he uses that to create the stab in a song called Say Yeah. So there's a lot of useful applications for Granulator, but if you don't have Ableton, or I think it's a Max for Live application, so you have to go to download this from like, I don't know the exact website, but it's a Max for Live device. So if you don't have that, or if you don't have this version of Ableton, which allows you to get this Granulator II, then just use Sampler. But that's basically how I would create these house stabs. If you want to create them by yourself on your own in MIDI, just create like some kind of a chord, like a minor chord, minor seventh chord, put in the MIDI, layer it with some different elements, and then you can get your own like cool samples and then resample it. So if you enjoyed this video, please comment down below what you liked about it, and also let me know what other videos you want to see me make. If you're not yet subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you'd like to check out any of my Serum preset packs, I'll put links down below for those as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.